Well, I'm back in my favorite chair and I'm ready to continue the story of finding Gobi. Yesterday's reading was so stressful, running in 120-degree heat, and we left off with Dion not feeling very well, so let's get started. Dion stumbled toward the car. As he got closer, the two men inside jumped out. "Are you okay?" one of them asked. "Do you want some water?" "I need to sit in the car," Dion replied. "I don't feel very well." That was an understatement. He felt awful. His head was pounding, and his chest hurt, and his vision was blurry, and he felt as if he was about to throw up or fall down or both. But he hoped that sitting in the car's air conditioning for a few minutes would make him feel better. It did at first. The cold air felt amazing. Dion just sank down into the seat and closed his eyes. He thought he'd never feel cool again. When he opened his eyes, he saw the car's dashboard display. "Does that really say 132 degrees?" he asked. "Yeah," said the guy behind the wheel. Both he and the other volunteer were watching Dion closely. He knew that if they thought he couldn't continue, they might force him to quit for the day. He couldn't let that happen. "Can I have the water?" Dion asked instead, pointing at a water bottle sitting in the drink holder. The volunteers nodded, and one of them handed him the bottle. It was so cold, some of the water was still ice. Dion drank it down and ate one of his energy gels as well. Then he sat back and waited, but he wasn't feeling any better. In fact, now that he'd gotten used to the air conditioning, he realized he was actually feeling worse. His head was spinning, and he could barely focus his eyes. The band across his chest was getting tighter and tighter, and each breath was a struggle. "Come on," he muttered to himself. He knew that he needed to get back outside. Every second that he sat here was a second he lost in the race, but somehow he couldn't make himself move, and just thinking about going back out into that heat again made his heart race even faster. Dion discovered he was panting for air. Then he noticed the volunteers watching him in the mirror. He must have looked as if he were dying. For a second, Dion wondered if he was dying, but he refused to believe that. He still had a race to run, and a wife waiting back at home, and family and friends, and a small dog he just knew would be sitting there at the finish line watching for him. He couldn't let her down. To distract himself, Dion asked about the only runner ahead of him. "How long ago did Zing come through?" The driver shrugged. "About 20 minutes before you." Dion had asked at the last checkpoint and gotten the same response, so Zing had only had a 20-minute lead until all this. "How did he look?" Dion wanted to know. The other volunteer shook his head. "Not great," the man admitted. He was struggling a lot and just walking. Dion sat up straighter. Walking? If Zing was walking, he must be out of energy too, which meant Dion could still catch him and take the lead. That was all the motivation he needed. With a deep breath, Dion grasped the door handle, shoved the door open, and stumbled out of the car. It was like walking into a wall of heat, and he had to squint against the blinding sunlight. But he managed to straighten up and then put one foot back on the path, then the other. He was doing it. With each stride, his confidence returned, and his pace improved. Soon he was running again. Not as fast as he had before, but that was fine. It was enough that he was heading in the right direction and maintaining a somewhat decent pace. It didn't last, though. After running a few hundred feet, Dion found he had to slow to a walk. He walked to the next flag, then he ran from there to the one beyond, then he walked again. It wasn't a fast process, but right now it was the best he could manage. Soon he'd forgotten all about trying to catch up to Zing. Now Dion just wanted to finish the day's run and go collapse in his tent. Eventually he reached the top of the sand dune and saw the day's finish line up ahead, and waiting near it in the shade was a certain bundle of sandy brown fur that sat up and charged him as soon as he was close enough for her to be sure. Dion smiled as he lurched over the finish line. Gobi had run the last few hundred feet with him, though after that she ran back to reclaim her spot in the shade. Zhang was already there, as was another runner, Brett. They both waved, and Dion waved back. He'd have to find out later if he had made up any of that time. For right now, though, it was enough to know that he had completed the day's run. He was still in the race. Thinking about that made Dion remember where he'd been this afternoon. He spotted a race volunteer and hurried toward him. "Any news on Tommy?" Dion asked. The volunteer smiled. "It's amazing," he answered. They got him cooled down, and eventually he started running again. Flippo's with him, and they're doing okay. Dion nodded. Flippo was a Swiss runner and a nice guy. Tommy was in good hands. For the first few minutes after finishing, Dion just rested. He drank more water, too, and petted Gobi, who was thrilled to be reunited. Eventually, Dion got up and wandered to the camp. Along the way, he spotted a clipboard listing the runners' times. He, Brett, Zing, and another runner named Jax were the only racers who had finished today's run so far. But then he saw Zing's time and groaned. The Chinese runner had beaten Dion by 40 minutes. Dion knew there was no way to be able to make that up. There was only one more day of running, and it was a shorter distance than the others. A nice, easy run to finish out the race, which was great if you were just out to run. But if you were looking to catch up with someone who was more than a half an hour ahead, you probably wouldn't ever catch him or her. There just wasn't enough time, which meant he couldn't win the race. But after allowing himself to be frustrated for a few minutes, Dion took a deep breath, because now that he thought about his placement today and what had caused it, he realized something surprising. To help someone in need was more important than the race result. It was another couple of hours before Tommy finally arrived. Flippo Rossi was with him, and though they were both clearly tired, they made it across the finish line together. People were crowded around Tommy, congratulating him. Everyone heard about how much trouble he had, and the fact that he'd still managed to complete today's leg was nothing short of amazing. Then Tommy spotted Dion. Next thing, Dion knew the runner was pushing his way through the crowd. Everyone pulled back and gave them a little room, and then Tommy was throwing his arms around Dion and hugging him tight. "Thank you," Tommy said. There were tears in his eyes. "Thank you." Dion found that he was having a hard time keeping his eyes dry, too, so he nodded, acknowledging the thanks. Then he turned away. The tent felt like an oven, but Dion was too exhausted to care. He inflated his mattress and sank down onto it. With a short bark, Gobi hopped up as well and turned in a tight little circle before settling down beside him. Dion nodded and patted her head, but his mind was already starting to drift and his eyes to close. The next thing Dion knew, he was sound asleep. Dion woke to his tent mate, Mike, shouting at him. "Get up!" his friend yelled. Dion blinked. Why did the tent seem so much shorter than usual? Then his brain kicked in and he understood what happened. The tent had been blown down, and judging by the noise howling around outside, they were caught in a sandstorm. Dion grabbed Gobi and crawled outside. The sand stung his hands and face, but he did what Richard instructed and laid down on the tent to keep it from blowing away. Everyone was rushing around and shouting to be heard over the wind. Dion waited for someone to come by and to help with put their tent back up, but no one did. Finally, he and Gobi went looking. They found a woman named Nurali who had sent the men around to the tents to fix them. They argued about the tent. Nurali said they would fix it, but it could be a while. Dion said they'd already been waiting a while. In the end, Nurali just walked away. The storm continued, and by midnight they heard that it was only going to get worse. The organizers finally decided to abandon the camp for night. They gathered all the runners together against a row of low cliffs nearby so they could have at least some shelter from the wind and dust and sand. It didn't help much, but Dion and Gobi made the best of it. Around dawn, a bus arrived. It took the runners to a national park nearby. The park had a small museum by the front entrance, and all the runners hurried inside. Dion kept Gobi close to him. Gobi was having fun, admittedly. Waking up in the middle of a sandstorm hadn't been pleasant, but crawling out of the tent had been an adventure. And then there'd been the people running everywhere and shouting. Gobi had barked a few times to join in. She hadn't liked the wind or the sand that got everywhere, but next they'd gone on the bus. She'd never been on a bus before, and it had taken them to this building and put all of them inside, and there were trees in there. Gobi had never heard of trees inside a building before. She could relieve herself without having to go inside. How neat was that? Fortunately, this day was always planned to be the only rest day of the long week race after the longest leg. So they stuck to their schedule and let the runners just relax and take it easy. Many of them bought drinks and snacks at the museum's little shop. Dion spent the time talking with Richard and two of their teammates, Mike and Alan. "What are you going to do about that little one?" Mike asked at one point. All of the runners had grown fond of Gobi, but particularly Dion's teammates, and she seemed to thrive on all the attention. She was certainly enjoying the museum and the fake trees and some of the exhibits. Dion hoped the museum wouldn't be too upset if they noticed that. Still, their snack bar was making lots of money off all the runners, and they shouldn't be too angry. He considered Mike's question. He's certainly gotten attached to the little dog over the last few days, and now he realized that he couldn't imagine leaving her behind, not even if it meant finding her a good home here in China. Instead, he found himself replying, "You know what, Mike? I've made up my mind. I'm going to find a way to bring her home with me." Gobi barked and licked his nose. It was almost as if she understood and was saying that she approved. Oh, I don't know about you, but I'm so thankful that they are safe for a time. We'll see what happens tomorrow. Have a great day.